While most Americans are familiar with the 2001 hijackings, few are familiar with the 2001 anthrax attacks. These acts of terrorism were not perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, but supposedly were perpetrated by Bruce Edward Ivins, who was a senior researcher and vaccinologist at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease. Today, in the spirit of Halloween season, I will be going over the spooky story of the 2001 anthrax attacks in episode 0 of the Ultra Podcast. Greetings. My name is U. Tubman, and without further ado, let's get on with the show. So just a week after the 9/11 hijackings, the 2001 anthrax attacks happened. It hit the United States in 2 waves of mail attacks. The primary batch of anthrax letters were dated September 18th, 2001, and had a Trenton, New Jersey postmark. A total of 5 letters are believed to have been mailed at the given time to CBS News, ABC News, NBC News, and the New York Post, all of which are located in, you'd guess it, New York City. There was also one apparently mailed to the National Enquirer at the American Media Incorporated headquarters in Boca Raton, Florida. So this guy, Robert Stevens, right, he's this journalist at the Sun tabloid, which is also published by AMI, and he dies on the 5th of October, 2001, 4 days after checking into a Florida hospital with an undiagnosed illness that was causing Robert to have shortness of breath as well as vomiting. By the way, spoiler alert, it's anthrax, while the New York Post and NBC letters were found. Interestingly, the existence of the other 3 letters are only inferred because, the authorities found individuals at ABC, CBS, and AMI who had become infected with anthrax. Scientists examining the anthrax from the New York Post letter said it appeared as well, quote, a clumped, coarse, brown, granular material that looked like dog food. They could have just called it dog food. I mean, most dog food is clumped, coarse, brown, and granular. But anyways, the second round of anthrax contained 2 more anthrax letters. They had the same Trenton postmark, however, they were dated October 9th, which is 3 weeks after the first mailing. The letters were addressed to a pair of Democratic senators, and prominent ones, Tom DeShell of South Dakota and Patrick Leahy of Vermont. Now, these weren't just any senators, as I said, it's, at the time, DeShell was the Senate Majority Leader, and Leahy was head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The dash L, we'll get back to why that's so important, but the Deschelles letter was opened by an aide named Grant Leslie. So on October 15th, the government mail service was shut down. The sealed Leahy letter was found in an impounded mail bag on November 16th. The Leahy letter had been misdirected to a State Department mail annex, which was in Sterling, Virginia. Because of a zip code error, it was misread, and unfortunately a postal worker there by the name of David Hose contracted inhalation anthrax. So the thing about the second batch of anthrax was it was a lot more potent than the first anthrax letters. The material in the Senate letters was a highly refined dry powder consisting of just 1 gram of nearly pure spores. Several conflicting news reports appeared, some claiming the powder had been weaponized with silica. We'll get back to the reason why it's a bit more complicated than that. But bioweapons experts, basically said after viewing the images that they saw no indication of weaponization. And tests at the Sandia National Laboratories in, I think, 2002 confirmed that the attack powders were not, they hadn't been weaponized. Now, to the normal viewer, it might sound a bit weird hearing the phrase weaponized anthrax, because it implies that there's an anthrax that is not used as a weapon. It implies unweaponized anthrax, which, no such thing. There's no anthrax that isn't used as a weapon. But the distinction is important. The distinction has relevance. Normal anthrax, both artificial and naturally occurring, often are on the larger end and tend to clump together in chain-like structures. While this doesn't really make it safe, it does mean you're at a much lower risk, much more lower risk of lung infection, because the spores, they're too large to infiltrate the lung tissue. However, weaponized anthrax are spores that have been milled down very, very small to something like 1 to 5 microns, and they can't be allowed to clump together. So you would need to add some type of anti-caking agent, kind of like tricalcium phosphate, bentonite, or that aforementioned silicon dioxide. Something like that is a lot more deadly, much more deadly than standard anthrax, and it doesn't really occur naturally in such large quantities. It basically is only artificial. And to even start producing weaponized anthrax requires a certain amount of buy-in. So there's already a small pool of suspects when anthrax is weaponized and used. I mean, there's a reason only 17 countries have really weaponized anthrax. That being said, while it wasn't weaponized, it was incredibly dangerous. So it's easy to understand why people believed it could be Iraq, Now, you might think that the fact that the U.S. is one of those 17 countries indicates that, members of the federal government, might be prime suspects. You have to keep in mind that in the early 2000s, people did trust their governments and couldn't really picture their governments killing them with anthrax. It's not like nowadays where, that sort of stuff is taken for granted. But anyways, we'll get on to the next thing. So if we look over the casualties, 22 people developed anthrax infections, half of whom, contracted the especially life-threatening inhalation variety. 5 died of inhalation anthrax, these being Stevens, 2 employees of the Brentwood Mail Facility in Washington, D.C., those being Thomas Morris Jr. and Joseph Kersing, and 2 whose source of exposure to the bacteria is still unknown, those being Kathy Nguyen, that's a Vietnamese immigrant resident in the New York City borough of the Bronx, who worked in the city of New York. And the last known victim, Audley Lundgren, who is a 94-year-old widow of a prominent judge from Oxford, Connecticut. The FBI also spent a lot of time following up on copycat hoaxes and false positives in Florida, Nevada, Malaysia, New York, and England. A lot of time was wasted by people fooling around and basically just mailing white powder to scare people, that they knew or something. And, that was a big waste of time, but that was nothing compared to the time wasted based on the misinformation put out by the media, which really put the FBI on a lot of goose chases when they could have been doing some actual work. In October 2001, ABC chief investigative correspondent Brian Ross, this sleazeball, linked the anthrax sample to Saddam Hussein because of it purportedly containing this unusual additive of bentonite. On October 26th, Ross said, sources tell ABC News the anthrax in the tainted letter sent to Senate Majority Leader Tom DeShell was laced with bentonite. The potent additive is known to have been used by only one country in producing biochemical weapons, Iraq. It is a trademark of Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. The discovery of bentonite came in an urgent series of tests conducted at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which is an important place. We'll get to that later, and elsewhere. On October 28th, Ross also said that despite continued White House denials, 4 well-placed and separate sources have told ABC News that initial tests on the anthrax by U.S. Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, have detected trace amounts of the chemical additives bentonite and silica, a charge that was repeated several times, October 28th and October 29th. So, on October 29th, 2001, a White House spokesman, this guy named Scott Stanzel, disputed reports that the anthrax sent to the Senate contained bentonite, an additive that had been used in Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's biological weapons program. Stanzel said, based on the test results, we have no bentonite had been found. That was in his own words. Later in the day, this guy named Major General John Parker, at a White House briefing stated, we do know that we found silica in the samples. Now, we don't know what that motive would be or why it would be there or anything, but there is silica in the samples, and that led us to be absolutely sure that there was no aluminum in the sample because the combination of silicate plus aluminum, is sort of major ingredients of bentonite. Just over a week later, Homeland Security Advisor Tom Ridge, in a White House press conference on November 7th, stated, "The ingredient that we talked about before was silicon. Neither Ross at ABC nor anyone else publicly pursued any further claims about bentonite, despite Ross's original claim that 4 well-placed and separate sources had confirmed its detection." And that's the thing really about anonymous sources. It's like, you see the media do this a lot where, they know something is very flimsy. And so instead of citing someone reputable, they cite anonymous sources, because they have to cite anonymous sources because no one legitimate would make such claims about bentonite in the anthrax, and that's a little trick the media does, is that when it knows that its quote-unquote sources aren't necessarily reputable, it will transfer the trust factor onto themselves, and basically, instead of just trusting some 4 sources that, don't even have the courage to disclose themselves, you can trust the paper, the reputable paper. I mean, ABC is obviously a news channel, but it's the same principle. They basically take on the trust because you trust the reputation of the ABC. It's you trust you trust Ross, but not anymore. The media isn't really trusted that much anymore. Especially after Trump and after the elections and after everything, including the current pandemic. No one trusts the media, so it's a lot harder for them to get away with this sort of anonymous sources stuff. That's why I think a lot of things during the Trump administration didn't really stick, because no one really trusted the media, so none of the quote unquote scandals really stuck to President Trump. And whether that's a good or a bad thing that the media has lost its credibility is another story entirely. But all in all, in this case, they really hampered an ongoing investigation by the FBI, misdirecting them. Although ABC was obviously not alone in misdirecting people. The Guardian reported in early October that American scientists had been implicated, and that Iraq was the source of the anthrax. And literally one day later, the Wall Street Journal editorialized that Al-Qaeda perpetrated the mailings, with Iraq as the source of anthrax. A couple of days later, John McCain suggested, quote unquote, on the Late Show with David Letterman, that the anthrax may have come from Iraq, and they were all complicit in this. Is a right wing, left wing. It doesn't really matter. It was they wanted Iraq to be the source of the anthrax. That wasn't really up for discussion. Just like a lot of things aren't up for discussion anymore. But we'll get on to White House statements. Statements by the White House and public officials, quickly proved that there was no bentonite in the anthrax attacks. Quote, "No tests ever found or even suggested the presence of bentonite. The claim was just concocted from the start." And it just never happened. Nevertheless, a few journalists repeated, ABC's Bentonite report for a few years, even after the invasion of Iraq had proved there was no involvement, because I really do want to emphasize that, they really wanted Iraq gone. That was, whether or not 9/11 happened, Iraq was going to be gone. But anyways, there was, however, a lesser known dispute over silicon content brought up by the scientific community, which has a bit more weight, specifically that the person of interest lacked the equipment to infuse silicon into some of the anthrax. Despite the silicon content, the person of interest didn't really seem to have the means or the know-how to put silicon, to add it, to make it, more deadly, to make it weapons grade. But the thing is, right, silicon is naturally occurring. So while not all not all the anthrax had silicon in it, some of it did have silicon in it, and that was a naturally occurring thing. And we can tell it's naturally occurring because instead of it being a silicon coating right on the outside of the spores, silicon was within. It was, it emerged from the anthrax samples and wasn't, laced on it. But another thing is, just because, you couldn't find the equipment, doesn't mean that the equipment necessarily didn't exist. Not to get all Bush on you, but they found the letters, right? And they found out they were copies, and they inferred from that there were originals, but they have no proof that they're originals. But just because there was no proof that there were originals, it's pretty universally accepted that there were originals because there were copies, and while I don't think that they necessarily I don't think the guy necessarily had the equipment to make silicon, weaponized anthrax. I do think that it's not necessarily true that the equipment wasn't there, because, a lot of things weren't there. And that's the thing about this case. There was a lot of holes that still haven't really been filled out, even 20 years later, which is quite incredible. But we'll get on to the rest of it. Some real progress was made when they analyzed the particular strain of the anthrax material which was used in the attack. All the anthrax was derived from one particular strain of anthrax known as the Amos strain, taken from a cow in Texas in 1981. It was first researched at United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease, USAMRID, in that Fort Detrick, Maryland, which will continue to be relevant in this whole thing. The Amos strain was then distributed to 16 bioresearch labs within the U.S. and 3 other locations, those being Canada, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. It would have probably been a lot easier if the FBI and CDC hadn't given the green light for the destruction of Iowa State University's Anthrax archive, which was liquidated the 10th of October 2001. Nevertheless, they were able to figure it out, and in December 2001, the Institute for Genomic Research began DNA sequencing using anthrax taken from the deceased Robert Stevens. The sequencing was first finished within about a month, and the analysis was published in the Journal of Science in early 2002. In June 2002, radiocarbon dating conducted by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory established that the anthrax was cultured no more than 2 years before the mailing. So this wasn't something held on for a while. It was 2 years old. Early in 2002, it was noted that there were variants and mutations in the anthrax cultures that were grown from powder found in the letters. This sort of complicated matters. Scientists at the TIGR sequenced the complete genomes from many of these isolates during a period from 2002 to 2004. This sequencing identified 3 relatively large changes in some of the isolates, each comprising a region of DNA that had been duplicated and triplicated. The size of these regions ranged from 823 BPs to 2,607 BPs, and all occurred near the same genes. From roughly 2003 to 2006, the repository and the screening of the 1,070 Amos samples in the repository were completed. Based on the testing, the FBI concluded that in flask RMR 1029 was the parent material of the anthrax spore powder. A researcher by the name of Ivins had been the sole controller over the flask, which brings us to the person of interest. So who was Bruce Edward Ivins? Before we get to the direct case stuff, I think it's important to really get a grasp of this guy's life. So, this Bruce Edward Ivins character was born in Lebanon, Ohio, which, for those of you who don't know where the hell that is, it's a small town. It's about 300 miles northeast of Cincinnati. Well, shoot, maybe some of you don't even know where Cincinnati is, so yeah, it's Ohio. It's like southern Ohio, I think. His parents were Thomas Randall Ivins and Mary Johnson, and this is a pretty strange story in itself. These guys owned a pharmacy. I think it's Ivins Pharmaceut. I'm not sure what the name was, but I'll give you the long and short of the story is that Ivan's mother was pretty rough, and kind of damaged Bruce. I don't want to get all psychological on you, but she was pretty rough, and apparently Ivins would eventually hear that his mother attempted to abort him, which definitely definitely wasn't the greatest story. When she discovered she was pregnant with Bruce, she repeatedly tried to abort the child by throwing herself down the set of stairs. Just to give you some idea of why Bruce Edward Ivins might have been damaged, falling down the staircase might have been one, and having a mother who would do that to a kid, probably didn't raise him the best. But in spite of his mother's incredible amount of BS, Ivins actually turned out pretty well, at least educationally. I mean, he was kind of a nerd that, wasn't necessarily the most popular, but he graduated with honors from University of Cincinnati with a Bachelor's of Science degree in 1968, an MS degree in 1971, a PhD degree in 1976, all in microbiology. Ivins conducted his PhD research under the supervision of Dr. Peter F. Bonventure, and his dissertation focused on the different aspects of toxicity in disease-causing bacteria. So, obviously he was destined to deal with anthrax, and he did. He was a scientist at the age of 36, and became a senior biodefense researcher for, you guessed it, U.S. AMRAD in Fort Detrick, Maryland. And he continued that career for 18 years. And he conducted research on Legionella, cholera, although it wouldn't be fair to characterize his career as just that. He had been doing other stuff, like, he was, not to get too personal, he was a juggler. He played keyboard at his church. I think it's Evangelist church. He was a member of the American Red Cross, and this guy had a life. I mean, he also had a lot of weird stuff, which we'll get into a little later. But back to the research. In the year, I think it's 1979, and this is roughly around the time of the Anthrax outbreak in the old Soviet Union city of Sverdlovsk. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Now I think it's called Yekaterinburg, which killed, at least 105 people after an accidental release at a military facility. This really got him, hooked on, learning about anthrax, and kind of shaped his view on what was important, in life. Ivins published, 44 scientific papers, some dating back to his time in 1969. And, he had a pretty large career, but he began focusing on, bioterrorism, which, he would continue even after, oddly enough, the Anthrax attacks. He would still he didn't keep a low profile. He was still publishing papers in 2006. And, he often cited the 2001 Anthrax attacks in his papers to bolster the significance of his research in the years, the subsequent attacks. It's quite appalling stuff, obviously it's more complicated than that, but, geez. So Ivins also was the co-inventor of 2 U.S. Patents for anthrax vaccine technology. That being U.S. patent 6,316,006, and U.S. patent 6,387,665. Both of these patents are owned by his employer at the time, the United States Army. And in 2003, Ivins and his 2 colleagues received the Decoration of Exceptional Civilian Service, the highest award given to Defense Department civil employees. for helping solve technical problems in the manufacturing of anthrax vaccines. So, if you're putting it together, you can sort of understand why this guy might have done some stuff. But with that sort of holistic view of, I hope it's holistic, a good rounded view of his life and his education, we can really get to the sort of the meat of his life, which unfortunately is the end of his life. Bruce, after he worked for 18 years at the government's biodefense lab at Fort Detrick, when he was a biodefense researcher, the top biodefense researcher, actually, according to most of his colleagues. The Associated Press said on August 1st, 2008, that he had apparently committed suicide at the age of 62. It was, widely reported on, and it was guessed that the FBI was about to press charges against him. But the evidence was, in the view of a lot of people, kind of circumstantial. And the grand jury in Washington reported that it was not ready to issue an indictment. Rush D. Holt Jr. represented the district where the anthrax letters were mailed. And he said that circumstantial evidence was not enough, and asked the FBI director, Robert Mueller, to appear before Congress to provide an account of the investigation. Mueller has a long career that even stretches into things like the Trump and Biden administration, of basically not going with sort of disappointing things when it comes to investigations. There was a lot of pressure put on Mueller to draw a connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda to the anthrax attacks, and he had looked into it, but he didn't really budge on it, and he was like, actually it wasn't them, and that really pissed off the Bush administration, along with the rest of the White House. And he continued that sort of career into the late 2010s, where basically he was given the Mueller probe, and he sort of gave this very wish-washy, non-committal statement that really killed the scandal that was, I forgot which scandal. Trump has so many scandals, some of them really fake, that, you lose track of them. But basically, the one that Mueller was involved in lost all steam. And, was viewed as an exoneration by some and as a indictment by others. But anyways, back to Ivins' case. Ivins' death, really left some questions unanswered. First off, so, scientists with sort of a germ warfare background said that there wasn't really evidence to say that this guy had the skills to turn anthrax into an inhalable powder. Alan Zielkoff aided, who aided the FBI investigation, had stated that, quote, "I don't think vaccine specialists could do it. This is, aerosol physics, not biology." Which, okay, I get it. It's more complicated than vaccine stuff, obviously, and it's more complicated for the average guy. But, this guy wasn't really a slouch. This guy, if you listen to my background on this guy, this was a pretty smart guy, and it probably wouldn't have been too huge of a leap for this guy to learn some aerosol physics and then apply that to his biological background. I don't think it would have been as difficult as they're putting it out to be. you know, obviously this this is not rocket science. This is, you know, bioscience, but these are smart people, and I think if, you know, you're working on something like an anthrax vaccine and you're that committed, it wouldn't be that hard to put some time into physics, you know, just saying. So this guy, W. Russell Brinn, who worked in the bacteriology division of the Fort Detrick Research Facility, he said that Ivins was hounded by the FBI agents who raided his home twice. And he was hospitalized for depression during that time. According to Brinn and the local police, Ivins was removed from his workplace out of fear that he might harm himself or others. One of them was quoted as saying, I think he was just psychologically exhausted by the whole process. You know, Brinn said, there are people who you just know are ticking time bombs. He was not one of them, which, you know, is kind of rich. You know, if anything, you take a look at this guy, and I obviously didn't cover all of his life, but I covered his sort of early age stuff, early influences, and his education. But there were a lot of red flags that definitely indicated this guy was a bit of a ticking time bomb. Like, I'll just share one anecdote with you, maybe a couple anecdotes, but so this guy, quite a you know, there's some parts of him that were, you know, kind of cool, but, you know, some of the kind of crazy stuff. You know, Ivins was reportedly obsessed with this college sorority group called Kappa Kappa Gamma. Ever since, you know, he was rebuffed by a woman in the sorority during his days as a student at University of Cincinnati. And he even edited the Wikipedia on the topic, you know, incessantly, which, you know, not saying anything about Wikipedia editors, but there are some funny edits. Let's put it that way. You know, it was later found out by, of all things, a United States government investigative panel called the Expert Behavioral Analysis Panel. Issued a report that in March 2011 that detailed Ivins' sort of shenanigans. He had tormented this one KKG member at the University of North Carolina named Nancy Hagewood, where he stole her notebook, her lab notebook, which documented her you know, research and doctoral studies, and he also vandalized her residence. And obviously, you know, people, I hear you guys thinking like, oh, it's a notebook. You know, okay, he stole one of his notebooks, but you gotta understand, this is like before the computer era, you know. I mean, there were computers, but it's not as prominent, and a lot of people did all their research and their papers and all that stuff on their notebooks. So if you stole their notebooks, you were really derailing their educational, you know, prospects. It's a really big deal. And, you know, in a sort of very prankster way, which I think is indicative of his, you know, somewhat dangerous but not necessarily killer instincts, he sent an anonymous note to the girl when they were looking for the notebook, and basically just, you know, said, if you want it, here it is, which, you know, very odd and very prankish. But yeah, that was one of the crazy things he did. He also was reported to be a bit of an attention person, whatever that means. In terms of mental illness, you know, this is really where the red flags come in. So, what I mentioned before was sort of prankish kind of stalking behavior, but this should have set off some red flags. When he was applying for his job at the army, there were a couple ethical questions where he put question marks, as the answer. And, when you put a question mark for an ethical question, that's a red flag. But the U.S. Army doesn't really necessarily care about things like that. They care about results. And, I mentioned before this guy was, he was smart and well researched, and he did a lot of work, and so that's really what the Army cared about. They didn't care about the clear signs that this guy was a ticking time bomb. He saw, I think it was some type of therapist or psychologist, and he took several medications, including a antipsychotic medication, which kind of another red flag. This man had a lot of red flags, and if you want to hear the full wacky story, I would suggest either perusing your local Wikipedia page, or perhaps taking a look at some of the sources that I put in the description. There's a couple books, there's a couple recordings. There's a lot of stuff that you can look into this guy with. But I'll just leave it at this. He had red flags. So this idea, that he was not one of those ticking time bombs indicates that, maybe this Bryn guy had no idea what a ticking time bomb was. Because he certainly was one of them. On August 6, 2008, federal prosecutors declared Ivins the sole perpetrator of the crime when U.S. Attorney Jeffrey A. Taylor laid out the case to the public. The quote, genetically unique parent material of the anthrax spores was created and solely maintained by Dr. Ivins, unquote. But other experts, disagreed, and of course, this is the thing about news that also is kind of infuriating, is that you always get disagreements, because it's sort of like market capitalization. One side makes a claim, and then there's room for another side to make another claim, and it's really about getting the most out of a story, which oftentimes really gets in the way of dealing with real problems, like anthrax. But the disputes make money, and so they dispute things unnecessarily. Draw your own comparisons. But anyways, including biological warfare and anthrax expert Meryl Nass, who stated, "Let me reiterate, no matter how good the microbial forensics may be, they can only, at best, link anthrax to a particular strain and lab. They cannot link it to an individual," which that is some rich stuff, because by that standard, what can you really link to anyone? It was already kind of, the case was already pretty difficult, and that's just a pretty absurd standard to hold these people to. These FBI people who were working against not only the shenanigans of Bruce Edward Ivins, but we're dealing with the media and people just fooling around and all that. And basically, at least 10 scientists had regular access to the laboratory and its anthrax stocks, and possibly quite a few more, counting visitors and other institutions and workers at laboratories in Ohio and New Mexico that had received anthrax samples from the flask. The FBI later claimed to have identified 419 people at Fort Detrick and other locations who had access to the lab where flask RMR 1029 was stored, or who had received samples from flask RMR 1029. So, they didn't just pick Ivins, because he was the guy. They grilled everyone, these people weren't playing around. And, that sort of jumping to the defense of a guy who, commits suicide directly after hearing that he was being indicted, that sort of leaping to the defense of someone who's looks pretty guilty shows that, the scientific community, even back then, was not willing to take an L. They weren't willing to accept the fact that, some guy from their club caused, the disease outbreak, which they were really in charge of preventing. Which, draw your own modern conclusions based on that statement. So let me just deal with any allegations of conspiracies. Obviously this was the same time the whole 9/11 thing was happening. So, obviously there was same usual suspects, but this might be a surprise to hear me say this, but I like the FBI's explanation that Bruce Edward Ivins committed these attacks to save the Anthrax Vaccine program. And in order to explain that, we really have to go back to the sort of origins of the Anthrax Vaccine program and sort of understand it as a whole. So, the story there really starts, it's, I think, around the Gulf War era, and basically, people were a little worried about the deployment of anthrax, and a lot of measures were taken to deal with biological weapons, especially when the first Gulf War happened. So much so that we have this Gulf War syndrome from all the side effects of all the things that were done. But that there was like a cyclical interest in sort of anthrax vaccines. In 1993, the Am Shinrikyo group, used sarin. They weren't able to use anthrax, but they caused a significant amount of damage, and people suddenly got a lot more worried. It might not be a state anymore that does an anthrax attack. It might be a group of individuals. So now you're not even contending with states anymore. You're contending with people who can be very irrational, and that is very dangerous. Iraq in 1995 was found to have a bioweapons program that included anthrax, which, did not help Iraq's case, although Iraq wasn't really involved in the whole thing. And basically, members of the U.S. Armed Forces sort of realized that, bioweapons were going to become a problem very soon, and so they needed to have a program to deal with it. So things really escalated in 1997 when the Clinton administration really put the pedal to the metal. And it started a program that would go on to inoculate around 2 million U.S. military personnel with a total of 8 million doses. So the program, by 1998, the Clinton administration required the inoculation of all military members with the anthrax vaccine, known as the Anthrax Vaccine adsorbed AVA, and by the trade name Biothrax. And, if you know anything about the modern vaccine mandates, you can probably guess what happens next. A lot of people began challenging this, because there were some pretty dangerous side effects with this whole vaccine, and people could tell something was kind of up. So in 1999, at the Offutt Air Force Base, the first ever anthrax refusal court-martial in the United States Air Force was prosecuted in the case of U.S. versus Bickley. Captain Jeffrey A. Lustig, the USAF, prosecuted an airman who refused to get submitted to an immunization, and the airman was actually convicted, and he was administratively separated from the U.S. Air Force. And the thing about that is while you can sort of get rid of a few grunts in the military, the thing about pilots is there's not as many pilots as people think there are. These people, you put a lot of time and effort into training a pilot, into getting a pilot that is healthy, into getting a pilot that is motivated, into getting a pilot that is loyal, and if you counted them all up, you don't really have room to purge large sections of the Air Force, because that is expertise that does not grow very fast. And that's the reason you can see even now in the military there's a discrepancy between how the ground forces are treated versus how the Air Force is treated. Very, very funny memes exist about all that. But basically, the controversy combined with the FDA hearings and all the challenges that were put forth, and approval changes and scrutiny to Bioport's manufacturing process, it really put the halt on all of that. And it was at this point that while Bush was fine with going along with the sort of neocon line, it seemed like a losing issue to forcefully vaccinate certain people, especially members of the military, which it's a really bad look when you're pissing off veterans in the military and stuff. So it was really put on halt, and you could understand that for a guy like Bruce Edward Ivins, who had really put his life and soul into this project, it makes sense why he wouldn't exactly let it go, let all his work come to naught. And, the anthrax vaccine program, just empirically, was revived after the 2001 anthrax attacks. The anthrax attacks, as well, with 9/11, obviously, spurred significant increases in U.S. government funding of, biological research in general, as well as preparedness. For example, biowarfare-related funding at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, increased by $1.5 billion in the year 2003 And in 2004, Congress passed the Project BioShield Act, which provided $5.6 billion over 10 years for the purchase of new vaccines and drugs. Now, obviously, $5.6 billion might not sound like a lot compared to pandemic vaccine numbers nowadays, but back then that was a lot of money. And that back then, we actually we ran a surplus. We did not run a deficit, and and that's crazy to say, but yeah, we really that money was worth something back then. But anyways, these vaccines included the monoclonal antibody Raxibacumab. I hope I'm saying that right. Which treats anthrax, as well as Anthrax Vaccine, as an Anthrax Vaccine absorbed vaccine, which both were stockpiled by the U.S. government. So immediately after 9/11, well before the mailings and the letters involved were sent and it attacked people, the White House actually began distributing Cipro, the drug Cipro, the only drug approved by the FDA for the treatment of inhalation anthrax, to senior staffers. Now, obviously, some conspiracy people might jump on this, but I'm gonna chalk that up to just sort of graft. And that's the thing about a lot of things in the government, and especially in the Beltway. A lot of stuff is graft. A lot of people might say that like certain things that the military does, it's to conspire against you. It's mostly to pay a paycheck. A lot of things, a lot of unnecessary things actually, it really just comes down to providing jobs in a municipality, or paying off some defense contractor. Like we spend close to like $17,000 per soldier to equip them with the best equipment. I guarantee you it's not because we care about the soldier. I mean, yeah, to some degree there are people in the government who do care about soldiers, but it's mostly because that money, they want to get that money and they want it bad. It's and so I'm not sure if the Cipro was like them saying, "Ooh, there's going to be an anthrax attack." I think it's just like one, maybe there's a legal liability angle where they were told that they have this drug that they can distribute, and so in order to avoid liability, they said, well, we did everything we could. We distributed this drug, but I think that they bought those drugs so that someone could get paid, and that's really the story of most things: someone getting paid. Right. So Cipro is manufactured by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, who agreed to provide the United States with 100,000 doses of ciprofloxacin for like 95 cents per dose, a cut from the original asking price of $1.74 a dose. This was because, the Canadian government had previously overridden the Bayer patent, and they were worried. They thought that they were about to lose out big. And the U.S. government was, willing to use the same measure, and so they cut the price, because, at the end of the day, they still made a lot of money off of that. And yeah, they gave him that Cipro. Shortly after that, it was recommended, of course it was recommended, that doxycycline would be a more appropriate drug to treat anthrax exposure. But the Cipro was already bought, so what was done is done. Anyways, a widened use of the broad spectrum antibiotic ciprofloxacin had raised some concerns amongst scientists who thought that the new drug could cause the creation of more drug-resistant bacteria strains, which is always a risk when you're using antibiotics. And you see this a lot with people who don't like antibiotics in food and in medications in general. They're always worried that the disease will become a super disease that will be bacteria resistant. But this is the thing, right? That's just the nature of life. It's always an arms race, and that's just a fact of life. And diseases will always get tougher, and we just have to get tougher with the diseases. That is the nature of life. You can't just expect things to stagnate. That doesn't work. And while you don't have to create the disease, you don't have to create the problem, you shouldn't expect every little thing to create a problem. The antibiotics might create a new disease, but it also solves the current problem of the current disease. And we might have to make better drugs later, but that's just the world, man. It's gonna get a lot harder than that. So numerous corporations offered to supply, these drugs for free, contingent on the FDA approving their products for anthrax treatment, of course. These included Bristol Myers Squibb, which made gadifloxacin, Johnson & Johnson, who made levofloxacin, and GlaxoSmithKline, which made two other drugs. I'm not even going to try to pronounce those. Eli Lilly and Pfizer, if all those names sound familiar to you, also offered to provide the drug at cost, because of course Pfizer offered it at cost. Now, just because the anthrax vaccine had been revived, there had been a pretty serious lawsuits issued against this whole thing, and several injunctions that really went back and forth. And basically, this guy, Doe v. Rumsfeld, argued that the vaccines weren't proven and tested, and that they weren't following specific ordinances, and this basically dragged it out for quite a while. But still, while all these injunctions were happening, people were getting vaccinated. Sometimes it would cease because there was another injunction, and they would be given consent. They would have to ask you before they vaccinate you. And what was generally seen was people who had already begun the program continued it to the end. But a lot of people, after seeing the effects of all the lawsuits, actually decided not to even try the program, because it's the thing with people. If they see that there's a significant disagreement that something might be dangerous, they have a tendency to wait it out. And that's what a lot of people did while the lawsuits were just fumbling around. So we reach, by this point, 2008, and this is around the time that, this guy Bruce dies. Over 8 million doses of Biothrax, had been administered to over 2 million U.S. military personnel as part of the program between 1998 and June 2008. The whole program was stopped because, you had a couple shortages due to the manufacturer kind of having difficulty with the FDA. There was a lot of strange reactions to the vaccine that sort of put people off of it. There was a lot of controversy, and just generally was having a really tough time getting it through. And when I say side effects, I'm not just talking about like the short-term side effects, which were like reactions at the shot site, like itching, bruising, tenderness, swelling, redness. I'm also talking about like mobility issues, muscle aches, headaches, fatigue, stuff that you'd see in the Gulf War syndrome. And you'd have things like dizziness, trouble breathing, swelling of the lips and throat, rapid heartbeat. If this is sounding familiar, that's just a coincidence, hopefully. But the long-term effects of the anthrax vaccine were really what started putting it into the ground, because, by 2008, people could really see what the effects of this stuff were. And people were having, autoimmune arthritis, multiple sclerosis, lupus, infertility, this thing called allergic neuritis. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. It's nerve inflammation, basically, that might cause paralysis. Allergic uveitis. This is an eye muscle inflammation that can compress the optic nerve, and basically when you press the optic nerve enough, that can cause blindness. You had congenital disabilities in children, neurological damage, slurred speech, probably because of some, cognitive problem, impaired motor skills, so it's like hand malfunctioning, cognitive impairment, sort of forgetting a lot of things, a loss of balance, probably related to some type of inflammation in the ear, something that messes with your ability to balance. Your ears are important if you want to keep balance. And lack of coordination, which, I bet all of these things cause lack of coordination, so that shouldn't really count as one of the side effects. It's like already included in a lot of these. And, ultimately people were really put off by that. And that's what really, really killed this thing. The sad thing, though, is that, to this day, the DOD, did not announce a reevaluation of AVIP, nor did it really consider correcting the records of any previously punished soldiers, and that's the real sad thing, because a lot of people, for rejecting the vaccine, and justifiably, if you look at the symptoms, were punished unfairly, and that is honestly possibly one of the worst things that a state can do to its soldiers, is to hurt their honor. You can take a lot from a person, but honor is the one that kind of matters the most. That all being said about the costs and stuff about the vaccine, and how much it costs to make it and distribute it and all that, the costs of all that were nothing compared to the cost inflicted on the American people by this vaccinologist, which really were something to behold. Many buildings were partially contaminated by anthrax as a result of the mailings. The companies in charge of the cleanup and decontaminating of buildings in New York City had a lot of work. These included the ABC headquarters and a Midtown Manhattan building that was part of the Rockefeller Center and was home to the New York Post as well as Fox News. So there was the Biorecovery Corporation of Woodside in New York, as well as the Biorecovery Service of America, which was based in Ohio. Biorecovery provided the labor and equipment such as HEPA-filtered negative pressure air scrubbers, HEPA vacuums, respirators, cyclone foggers, and decontamination foam licensed by the Sandia National Laboratories. A total of 93 bags of anthrax-contaminated mail had to be removed from just the New York Post alone. The Hamilton, New Jersey postal facility remained closed till roughly March 2005. Its cleanup costed $65 million. The decontamination of the Brentwood postal facility, on the other hand, took 26 months and cost double at $130 million. The attack, led to one of the largest, confiscations and curtailment of U.S. mail, especially to U.S. media corporation. Checks, bills, letters, and packages simply stopped arriving for many people and businesses that had, resisted the cultural shift towards email. Because you have to remember, email was actually kind of new at the time, and a lot of people just preferred doing things by mail. You can't hack mail. Mail, when you write, it's much you give it a lot more thought than when you type out something, and also just a lot of people just didn't like using, like you'll meet old folks who don't really like computers and just don't want to bother with them. And also the thing about physical mail is that you can recognize someone's handwriting. You can you don't need a computer that costs a lot of money. It's just an envelope, a piece of paper and a pencil, and I guess a postage stamp. Whereas with a computer, it's you have the power, you have the physical computer itself, the circuitry. You have all that stuff to deal with, and people didn't want to do that. But really, when the anthrax attacks happened, a lot of people were pushed into shifting to online, which I would argue makes them more vulnerable, just as we can see now with all the hacks and how easy it is to trick someone into like opening a phishing email. But that's one other thing. So the United States Environmental Protection Agency led a collaborative effort to clean up the Hart Senate office building, where Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle's office was located, as well as the Ford office building and several other locations around the Capitol. It used $27 million of its funds for its Superfund program on the Capitol Hill anthrax cleanup. There was one FBI document that said the total damage exceeded $1 billion. So after the 9/11 attacks, the subsequent anthrax mailings, and just other things, lawmakers were pressed for legislation to combat future terrorist threats. And under heavy pressure from the Attorney General, John D. Ashcroft, there was like a bipartisan compromise in the House Judiciary Committee that allowed legislation for the Patriot Act to move up to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which, if you remember who was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, it was that Leahy guy from Vermont, the Patrick Leahy, right? And draw your own conclusions. People cite that as a conspiracy. I think there's a much more interesting thing, which was the other senator, Tom DeShell, who was also a victim of, well, not a victim, but he was a target of the anthrax attacks. He was privately spoken to, and this is what he said apparently. He was privately spoken to by Dick Cheney, who told him not to investigate the 9/11 attacks, which, very, very ominous character. Dick shoot my friend with a shotgun Cheney, But, all that, it's just endless theories that you could go into. And we really want to get to the end of this, so we'll just continue on. So a theory that Iraq was behind the attacks, based on purported evidence that the powder was weaponized in some reports that I mentioned before, these may have contributed to hysteria that ultimately enabled the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And that was really the aftermath of all this, because it wasn't just right. The guy Bruce Edward Ivins probably thought that, I'm just gonna revive interest in my little program by doing these things. But the thing is, these terrorist attacks have much bigger consequences, because there are much bigger players that are willing to take the opportunity to exploit a attack, and they did exploit it. And a lot of things happened because of this terrorist attack, and we still feel them to this day. So with a story this interesting, it had me wondering, as I guess it has all of you wondering by now, where's the movie? Yes, where is the movie? So there's actually a Canadian Anthrax movie, which, seemed to have been made before the attacks and was released, oddly enough, in 2001. It's Canadian. It's about cows and stuff. But it's a free, so you can watch it on your own. I won't spoil it. Spoiler, it's Anthrax. But there's a new show coming up, which I think it's 10 years later from the Anthrax documentary. Now they're making on the Discovery Channel the second season of a show called The Hot Zone, and it's dropping actually sometime this November, and it will be covering the Anthrax attacks. And it's got a pretty prominent Asian actor, so maybe look into that. Why now? So why are they doing it now? It's been 20 years since the attack happened. Why are they suddenly interested now? I suppose they probably hope to capitalize on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which is still somewhat fresh in people's minds, especially after the botched Kabul withdrawal that got people thinking of Saigon. A lot of people are still thinking about the Afghanistan withdrawal that they wanted to time for 9/11. Kabul fell, and actually slightly before 9/11, and so people got to discuss it as the Taliban were like eating ice cream in Kabul amusement parks. But there's also another angle to this. The ongoing pandemic has people interested in certain diseases, and along with skepticism towards vaccines, I would guess that the story about, an anthrax vaccine guy who gives people anthrax to revive his vaccine program will probably turn a few heads, and probably do well. I'm just assuming. But there's a lot of reasons to do it now. People can start filming. During the early stages of this pandemic, a lot of things got pushed off or canceled, and you have a glut of people who want to work in filming. So I would guess that now they are able to work on things, and they can work on a lot more things, including obscure cases about anthrax. So yeah, most of the sources that I've read seem to conclude that the 2001 anthrax attacks were related to 9/11 only in that A, they were terrorist attacks, and B, that they contributed to the pro-war sentiment against Iraq and Afghanistan. I kind of agree with that. I don't think there was a direct connection between 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. I don't think the Egyptians were connected with, and I say Egyptians because I think the guy who coordinated 9/11 was an Egyptian, and the guy from Ohio, yeah. But who knows? Maybe someday they'll open a file and I'll just be proven wrong. But we're still waiting on that Kennedy file, so I'm just gonna take a guess that we'll be waiting on the 9/11 file for quite a while. Anyways, I believe that people, in the same way that they capitalized on 9/11 to revive, interest in national security and, sort of revived foreign policy, the same thing happened with the anthrax vaccine, where, this event happened and people, for whatever their individual reasons were, decided to capitalize it, whether it was the newspapers who lied about bentonite and stuff to get ratings and to, get more pro-war sentiment, or whether it was those small-time pranksters who wanted to scare people by mailing them white dust. It's all people, doing their own thing, and just independently. I don't think it's a grand conspiracy. They didn't cause the attacks, but now that they knew the attacks happened, one could only seize the opportunity to push a pre-existing agenda, to implement a plan to do something that they already wanted to do. And really, this is a story that's as old as the USS Maine, if not older. So, what now? I guess the 2001 anthrax attacks, how do they mirror current events? So, as we went over, before the anthrax attacks and even during the time afterwards, there was a long legal battle between soldiers, rights advocates, and the government and such over taking the vaccine. And this stretched from the Gulf War era to somewhat of the modern era. And the controversy reached a boiling point, and eventually they couldn't really force people to do it that much. They had to suspend the program, I think. I'm not sure when. I think it was either 2008 or 2011. And in 2001, we'll take the story back a little. It did look like the military advocates for bodily autonomy were going to have a win with all the injunctions. But, the anthrax attacks, sort of normalized mandatory shots for a little bit and made the lives of people trying to advocate for bodily autonomy a lot more difficult. And we really see that these mandates actually laid the groundwork for the types of mandates that we're seeing in the current pandemic that are being, implemented against, this time not military people, but citizens. Whether it's, mandates to get a job, whether it's mandates to go to a restaurant, it's all there. But going back into the current pandemic, we see that people who are, not happy about these mandates, they are opposing the big three. I guess I'll call them the inoculation triad. And, I wonder if the opposition becomes too strong to the new administration, or to any new administration, will they distance themselves away from the mandates? Or, will certain members of the scientific community / academic elite be inspired by the actions of Bruce Ivins? Will a larger group of former Biden officials use their last moments in office to replicate the success of the anthrax attacks? Only time will tell. Anyways. So Bruce E. Ivins, as much as the guy had mental issues and was probably a hazardous person, it should be noted that he seemed to do this out of idealism, if we're to believe the FBI, out of a sense that the anthrax vaccine was vitally important to the national security of the nation, and that biological warfare was the next paradigm for modern warfare, which, it kind of is. I mean, we've yet to see a war just waged with, bioweapons, but, they exist, and, they're much easier to deploy than people think. If you take his life holistically, you can clearly see that, this idealist, as I'll put it, he did bad things, but, he's not necessarily a bad guy. He's a juggler. He played keyboard at his church. He was a member of the American Red Cross. Even in his worst moments, which we can see with what he sort of was doing to Nancy Hagewood and Kappa Kappa Gamma, he could have destroyed, her career, but he didn't. He just sort of showed that he could do it. And that sort of prankster-like fashion, to just give it back, is sort of shows that he's not necessarily killer material. In his letters to the news stations, he included information which, if redacted, could have killed more people. He identified the anthrax for one thing, and he mentioned antibiotics, which you probably wouldn't mention if you wanted them to die. And the FBI uncovered private conversations, which, this does not sound like the mind of a killer, maybe a crazy person, but not a killer, and I'll just read them out to you. Quote, "I can tell you I don't have it in my heart to kill anybody," unquote. Quote, "I do not have any recollection of ever having done anything like that. As a matter of fact, I don't have no clue how to make a bioweapon, and I don't want to know," unquote. Quote, "I can tell you, I am not a killer at heart," unquote. Quote, if I found out I was involved in some way, and unquote, quote, I don't think of myself as a vicious, nasty, evil person, unquote. Quote, I don't like to hurt people accidentally in any way. And he names several scientists at US AMRID wouldn't do that. And I, in my right mind, wouldn't do it. Now, of course, he says that, and then he laughs, which is noted, that he laughs after saying in his right mind, indicates that might be a little crazy. But, continuing with the quote, but I still feel responsible because it being the anthrax, wasn't locked up at the time. And so even then he takes responsibility for it. And, another thing to note, important thing to note, is that, this guy, when he had spoken to his psychologist or therapist, I'm not sure which one it was, he had mentioned that he had several plans, including several murders, and he told his psychologist that he had thought about, killing several people or doing some things that were dangerous, and that at the last minute he had sort of reneged on it. He had decided not to go through with it. And that shows some moral conflict, which isn't really present in a lot of cold-hearted killers. All that being said, this guy did do something that resulted in the deaths of 5 people, and it was quite a cost. Probably the reason he did this killing as opposed to the other ones was because, the means of killing was somewhat separated from the actual act of killing. Like, there was a degree of separation. But I think that if it had just come down to, killing 5 people, he would definitely not have just killed 5 people. Which gives some insight into how not good people, but, not bad people can, do really bad things. It's just about degrees of separation and, idealism. So we get on to the next thing. If this is what a not bad person is capable of, if this is what someone who's good at heart would do, I want you to imagine for a minute what a bad person is capable of, or better yet, a group of bad people with much more power, much more money, and much more evil laced within their hearts. And then realize that these people exist outside of your imagination. Now that is some spooky stuff. Well, that concludes the podcast. Subscribe so that you can stay tuned for the teaser trailer for our next episode. If you want to donate to the program, hold on to your money because we haven't really made a payment process at the moment. So you're going to have to wait to donate a little bit. For now, you can just email me if you're interested in donating. I'll just keep a mental note of, if you wanted to donate, and I'll send you a link once the Ultra Podcast is ready to receive donations. This is you, Tubman, signing off for the Ultra Podcast.